and their theaters were almost like amusement parks in a sense. So these films now, I think, are more like theme rides in a way. The value of a film that's like a theme park film, for example, the Marvel-type pictures, where the theaters become amusement parks, that's a different experience. And it's like I was saying earlier, it's not cinema, it's something else. You know, whether you go for that or not, but it is something else, and we shouldn't be invaded by it.
Marvel films are theme park rides.
I said superhero films.
Superhero films.
According to Scorsese, it's not cinema. I got to take a look at that, you know?
Was he jealous of the success?
Of course not. But I mean, he's Martin Scorsese.
You know what it is? You get older, you're used to cinema being a certain way.
Can I tell you something?
Yeah.
Do you actually think Martin Scorsese is upset about Marvel movies?
Yes.
So I've watched Spider-Man No Way Home twice now, and I think it's safe to say that it's probably among my top 3 favorite MCU films so far. It had a ton more heart and wit than the previous Tom Holland films, the fan service actually played a key role in the story and didn't feel too forced for most of it, and I loved how you were actually rewarded throughout the whole thing for having seen all previous Spider-Man movies. Yes, including this trash fire. It had everything I thought the best of Marvel has had to offer, and to no one's surprise, was the highest grossing film of last year. Needless to say, it was the largest and most long-awaited cinematic event of 2021. Much like another epic Marvel finale in 2019, a little-known flick known as Avengers Endgame. It was only the highest grossing film of all time, no big deal. These two films, though not without their flaws, were thrilling, well-earned conclusions to much-beloved sagas. Both an ultimate celebration of the characters we've come to know and love over the years, and yet still, the Marvel Universe shows no signs of slowing. We are due to get a whole bunch more Marvel movies for the MCU's Phase 4, and even a new trilogy in the works for Tom Holland's Spider-Man. Judging by how well these movies make bank, I'm 99.9% sure we've got even more planned beyond those announced. Of course, as exciting as these movies are, and always have been really, it's understandable that people will start to get a little weary. Not just with the Marvelverse in particular, but with the entire concept of superhero films in general, a phenomenon many have termed as superhero fatigue. Though beloved as many may be, as our media grows ever more saturated with cape-wearing crime fighters, it's no surprise that some audiences are going to want something different every once in a while. And this isn't something we can solely point fingers at the MCU for. Apparently the sort of burnout can take place in the traditional world of comic books too. Issues can lead up to a major event for our heroes, usually resulting in a huge crossover battle, and experience storytelling dips afterwards as writers scramble to explore new stories and ideas after such a long-awaited climax. If this sounds familiar, it's because the MCU pretty much patterned its entire storytelling structure after it, popularizing what we now know as the cinematic universe. And I gotta give it props for pulling off the concept incredibly well. To this day, I don't think there's a franchise that's been able to pay off years of build-up from multiple movies of various characters, at least to the level of profit success and mainstream fanfare Marvel has, turning movies like Avengers Endgame into major global events and an endless well of viral memes about Thanos' ass. It's also managed to transform superheroes into your once niche nerdy interest into something mainstream and accessible for everyone. Now, everyone and their grandmother knows who Rocket Raccoon is, arguably one of the most absurd heroes to come out of one of Marvel's once most obscure comic lines. Multiverses are now also a super well-known and honestly soon-to-be well-worn concept, no longer a term exclusive to passionate fans of sci-fi. But again, as we experience an oversaturation of these cinematic ideas and content, critics are worried that we're headed towards an inevitable fatigue. But are audiences actually getting tired of these movies? If we're talking the general public, all numbers point to no. As of now, Marvel movies are reported to have made over $25 billion worldwide, making it the largest movie franchise to date. In an interview with Variety, Kevin Feige stated that not only has there not been the quote-unquote superhero fatigue that people have been asking me about since years before Iron Man, but here we are having our biggest year ever. Our instincts have always guided us, and the successes have always just encouraged us to keep following those instincts. This quote came after the success success of Avengers Infinity War, raking in over $2 billion alone, and helping make 2018 the biggest year for Marvel in terms of profit. That is until the release of Endgame, which hauled in almost $2.8 billion worldwide. Business successes aside, there are also people like Danny DiPlacido of Forbes, who argue that superhero movies aren't just a fad that people are bound to tire from, but are simply a natural evolution of the traditional action film. Movies of this genre are just increasingly featuring superhuman-esque leads, even if they aren't necessarily one. A few examples that come to mind include the John Wick and Jason Bourne movies, and the badass leading heroines Charlize Theron and ScarJo are often typecast as. So it's clear that people still very much love their superhero fix, and I definitely fall into the category. I'm a huge sucker for the genre, Marvel or otherwise, on film or on TV, unless we're talking about the garbage this network spews out. However, like all popular things, that hasn't stopped the genre from growing its opinionated pool of critics, with many now questioning the actual quality of this saturated market, stoking fiery debates online on the impact these movies have on the film industry and its audiences. From measured responses such as, "There's just too many of them, they've gotten stale over time," to the hyperbolic "they're ruining cinema" argument, to the backlash by passionate fans defending the merits of their favorite movies, it's been a brewing conversation in recent times that I find have both its strong points and misfires, all the more fueled a few years ago by Martin Scorsese's apparently controversial opinions of the MCU. And as we venture forth into yet a new era of even more superhero-based media, it's a discourse that's stayed alive and well. But which side is in the right here? At the risk of sounding like a fence-sitting enlightened centrist, both. Which brings me to today's video. As somebody who loves both superhero and general franchise films and is honestly giddy for the multiverse of madness, as well as more independent, artsier films like much of Scorsese's stuff, I thought I'd dive into both the positive and negative aspects our superhero craze, specifically Marvel, have left on the industry, as well as the strengths and shortcomings of Scorsese's opinions and those who share them. I believe in supporting independent cinema and would love to see new ideas in this industry flourish. And I also admittedly feel like superhero movies add excitement and community to the cinematic experience. Is there room for the success of both in today's film industry climate, and is the latter really preventing this? But before we get into that, shout out to today's sponsor and the brand that made today's makeup possible, Game Beauty. If you've ever stared at a video game landscape and thought, that's an aesthetic, well, now you can wear some of the best kinds on your face. Game Beauty is a one-of-a-kind makeup brand that's transformed the color stories of common game sceneries into these unique, beautifully packaged 10-pan eyeshadow palettes. Produced in Italy, you get a diverse set of themes, from the dark, grungy scheme of Harbinger to the warm, fiery tones of Victory, two palettes I'm actually wearing right now, to the romantic pastels of Fantasy, and finally the earthy shimmers of Adventure. It's a makeup brand for nerds, by nerds, but even if you're just a fan of makeup and are simply looking for eyeshadow palettes with bold, colorful themes, then Game Beauty definitely delivers. I'm a cosplayer. I know that's a bit of a shock, so this was definitely right up my alley. For this video, Game Beauty was kind enough to send me their Harbinger and Victory palettes, and I was super impressed by how bright and pigmented every swatch was. The shimmers have a nice, buttery texture to them that make them both easy to apply and blend with other colors, and there are even some that feature pearl drops or specks of another lighter color for a subtle, glittery accent. The mattes have a thinner, more powdery texture to them, but the color is still pretty striking with a single swirl, and you can easily build upon it. Worn with primer, these colors can also last me the entire day, although I also did try testing wearing them without it, and though it did hold on pretty well for the first few hours, I gotta say it wasn't as vibrant, nor did it hold up as well as when I did use primer, so I definitely recommend that. Game Beauty were also kind enough to send me their exclusive eyeshadow brushes, which I actually used to make this look, and coincidentally enough, matches my outfit for this video. They've got a nice basic variety, and the soft, fine bristles make every color easy to blend with and comfortable to apply. Plus, I love the color. They're definitely the best looking brushes I have so far. I guess my only gripe is that they don't have more themes available yet, but they are an up-and-coming indie brand, so we're bound to see more from them in the near future. So if you want to indulge both your gaming and makeup addiction, go ahead and check out these palettes on their website, and use my code AnnaIsabel10 to get 10% off any purchase. All links in my description. Now let's get into this heated Marvel debate.
A couple of extremely esteemed directors have been, really vocal about how movies, the kind of whole Marvel universe and I guess big kind of blockbuster action movies are really, using words like despicable and like the death of cinema.
In a 2019 interview with Empire, Scorsese dropped a rather hot take on the pop culture behemoth that is Marvel films. I don't see him. I tried, but that's not cinema. Honestly, the closest I can think of them, as well made as they are, with actors doing the best they can under the circumstances, is theme parks. It isn't the cinema of human beings trying to convey emotional, psychological experiences to another human being. With many interpreting this as a belittlement of MCU films, his statement, as expected, caused quite a stir among the film community. Directors such as Kevin Smith and James Gunn jumped to defending their love and respect for the genre, and despite being huge fans of the filmmaker themselves, were quick to call out Scorsese's comments. Gunn, in particular, who directed both the Guardians of the Galaxy films, stated in a tweet, "Martin Scorsese is one of my 5 favorite living filmmakers. I was outraged when people picketed The Last Temptation of Christ without having seen the film. I'm saddened that he's now judging my films in the same way." Smith also referenced The Last Temptation of Christ in sharing his sentiments, saying that,
"Martin Scorsese made perhaps the biggest superhero movie ever made. Think about it. Who's the biggest superhero? Bang.
Even a few Marvel actors such as Tom Holland, Karen Gillan, and Natalie Portman voiced their dissenting opinions, stating that superhero movies and Oscar-worthy films are all the same. They're just done on a different scale, that there's a ton of heart and soul in these films, and that there's room for all types of cinema. But it wasn't all dissent thrown Scorsese's way. His remarks were echoed by directors like Francis Ford Coppola, who were a little less kind on the matter, calling Marvel films just straight up despicable. Like, okay, chill out. And just last year, Dune director Denis Villeneuve described Marvel films as simply a cut and paste of one another. That the problem today, well, if we're talking about Marvel, the thing is all these films are made from the same mold. Some filmmakers can add a little color to it, but they're all cast in the same factory. It doesn't take anything away from the movies, but they are formatted. A few months later, Scorsese wrote up an opinion piece in the New York Times in an attempt to clarify things, though emphasizing that he doesn't necessarily hate Marvel, and most certainly not franchise films in general. He doubled down on the sentiment that MCU films don't represent the type of cinema he and his fellow filmmakers have revered and been inspired by over the years. He also mentions his concerns around these films edging new, riskier cinematic ideas from the limelight, with franchise films like Marvel now, quote, your primary choice if you want to see something on the big screen. Now, a few people on the quote-unquote side of Scorsese, which also included Ridley Scott, Jane Campion, and Alejandro G. Iñárritu, have voiced some strong opinions, a couple more colorful than others, on the superhero genre as a whole, though I don't think it's at all fair to dismiss the category in its entirety. Beyond the MCU and DCEU, both before and after they became the cinematic cash cows they did, we've had plenty of unique superhero films that attempt to break your stereotypical comic book movie mold in their own ways. Films like Alex Proyas's 1994 noir action fantasy, The Crow, the dark, almost fairy tale-like whimsy of Guillermo del Toro's 2004 Hellboy, we don't talk about the new one, James Gunn's 2011 indie black comedy, Super, and who can forget Pixar's The Incredibles and the goldmine of memes that's DreamWorks' Megamind. 2 films that offer a satirical and almost parodic twist on the superhero tropes we're all too familiar with. All these are significantly different from each other in terms of story, style, and tone, and the last 2 are even animated. Watching each of them, you can feel the distinct personality of the directors shine through. But that being said, it's a bit of a different story with Marvel films in particular. As written in his piece for the New York Times, Scorsese states that what he deems as real cinema are not only films that offer a complex exploration of characters, but ones that bring revelation and artistic risks to the table. By not considering the Marvel Cinematic franchise as real cinema, he's therefore implying that their movies lack in these departments. And upon reading his statements, I thought that there might be some validity to his opinion. Being under the same brand and corporate enterprise, with studio execs constantly plotting and planning tie-ins to the next sequel or crossover event, these films, in an effort to maintain consistency, are more likely to have a methodical and formulaic structure to them. This, in turn, leaves plenty of them in danger of feeling like samey, safer, predictable pieces of entertainment. And at the same time, being 4-quadrant films, they do tend to overshadow non-franchise or indie ventures in terms of hype and marketing, making it more of a challenge for up-and-coming or more experimental filmmakers to break through the noise with their saturation in the market. So, at face value, it does seem like he has a point. But being a fan of these movies myself, I wanted to dig further into how true this really is. Commercial beasts as they are Marvel movies less in cinematic quality compared to non-franchise films? And is their supposed saturation in the market dragging down the quality of cinema in general? At least in the eyes of Scorsese and those who agree with him. In dissecting this, I thought it'd be fun to compare the top 3 critically rated Scorsese feature films, this being Mean Streets, Taxi Driver, and Goodfellas, with the top 3 critically rated Marvel movies, Iron Man, Black Panther, and Endgame, assessing them by his criteria of, quote, great cinema, the artistic risks they take, the revelations in their storytelling, and character exploration. I of course chose Scorsese with him being the voice behind all this. It's safe to say he considers his films, and rightfully so, the kind of cinema he wishes to see more of in theaters. So how do the most acclaimed films under Marvel stack up? Let's start with Marty. I think it's safe to say that when it comes to taking risk and trying new things on the big screen, Martin Scorsese is a cinematic godfather. The man, alongside his editor Thelma Schoonmaker, has made his mark on the world of film by popularizing innovative filmmaking techniques, such as the montage, the freeze frame, editing to the music, and the use of snappy, energetic scene cuts. He's a director who's never afraid to try new things, appropriately labeled as a dirty fighter of cinema by S.C. Lanham of Studio Binder, someone willing to try anything once, even making a kids film at one point, who'd have thought, and managing to walk a fine balance between auteur and commercial filmmaking. We see this in all 3 of his most critically acclaimed films, each directed and released before the 2000s, and yet watching them now, you never feel like their quality is of their time. We can already see his attempt at breaking basic filmmaking norms in the earliest of the bunch, 1973's Mean Streets, making use of long shots, voiceover narration, and character-driven camera work, which he would eventually master along with other film techniques in what I'd consider his magnum opus, Goodfellas. Marty's directorial focus on characters is also really effective in placing you right in the environment and mindset of the leads, whether it's playing with the intimate camera work of Taxi Driver or having his protagonists narrate their lives in Goodfellas. But it also helps, of course, that all 3 films are intense character studies, something I notice he loves to make in general. By centering his movies on a single lead, he's able to truly suck you into the harrowing world of drugs, crime, and mob violence with Henry Hill, the lonely desperation and psychological spiraling of Travis Bickle, and the inner guilt and moral conflicts of Charlie Kappa. His purposeful use of close-ups, environmental framing, emotive camera movements, and music choice further elevates these character explorations, inviting and immersing viewers into their personal journeys. All these filmmaking choices hook you into each of these films from the get-go, and are used consistently and creatively throughout them to keep you invested. At the same time, Scorsese masters unpredictability in these stories. The man has stated that he values genuine emotional revelation, mystery, and suspense because all 3 movies, and plenty of his other works beyond, apply this to great effect. The completely unhinged and maladjusted character of Taxi Driver's Travis leaves you in fear of what crazy shit he'll pull next. The entire film is like the experience of watching a really slow yet inevitable car crash, with moments that'll make you both cringe at and fear the guy at the same time. Yet De Niro plays the role in such a grounded, realistic way that it's like watching an actual person spiral, making his next moves all the more ambiguous. The gangster world of Goodfellas keeps you on your toes just as much as it does its leading characters. Some get what's coming to them when you least expect it, others may find themselves in unprecedented moments of danger. Just as our leads fear getting jumped or stabbed in the back in the most unexpected moments, you too are left hanging in this unsettling uncertainty of what's to come. Almost like you're in this drug-addled world of crime yourself, surrounded by untrustworthy mobsters. And the volatile personalities of Mean Streets leaves you guessing the moral choices leading man Charlie ultimately ends up making, as he navigates his increasingly complex circumstances. And finally, it helps that Marty loves his morally gray leads. All 3 movies feature incredibly flawed protagonists that will straight up make some up decisions. Some may even eventually spiral into pure unlikability. Yet, he still manages to make them compelling because it's these very things that make them feel grippingly real. They all make questionable yet very human decisions, building a stronger resonance and connection with audiences. And like I said with Taxi Driver's Travis Bickle, it adds to their unpredictability. All these choices together help make up incredibly memorable, innovative, and often confronting films, each bleeding with a personality that's distinctly Scorsese's. Alright, so how about Marvel? In my opinion, these guys' top films are solid, enjoyable movies, most especially Endgame, which I think is one of the greatest achievements the superhero film genre has to offer, but probably not in the ways Scorsese would consider. Off the bat, I do want to acknowledge that these guys obviously have a different approach to their movies compared to Scorsese, with them being a billion-dollar movie studio with dozens of filmmakers under their belt, and the other being a single independent filmmaker. But does this leave a dent in the quality of their films, as Marty says? In his New York Times op-ed, he writes that many of the elements that define cinema as I know it are there in Marvel pictures. What's not there is revelation, mystery, or genuine emotional danger. Nothing is at risk. The pictures are made to satisfy a specific set of demands, and they are designed as variations on a finite number of themes. They are sequels in name, but they are remakes in spirit, and everything in them is officially sanctioned because it can't really be any other way. That's the nature of modern film franchises. Market researched, audience tested, vetted, modified, re-vetted, and re-modified until they're ready for consumption. And sure, it's true that MCU films have to fit a certain mold in order to maintain the Marvel brand image, especially as part of the same universe structure. Filmmakers, in turn, are thus confined to a studio-approved template, which sadly caused a few talented directors like Edgar Wright, Patty Jenkins, and Ava DuVernay to walk away from projects they were initially signed onto. I think Wright put it pretty well when he said, "The most diplomatic answer is I wanted to make a Marvel movie, but I don't think they really wanted to make an Edgar Wright movie." And DuVernay, who was initially approached to direct Black Panther, said of her unfortunate exit, "This is my art. This is what will live on after I'm gone. So it's important to me that that be true to who I was in this moment. And if there's too much compromise, it really wasn't going to be an Ava DuVernay film." So it seems like a successful partnership between directors and Marvel hinges a lot on artistic compromise, particularly, of course, on the side of the filmmaker. And a lot of artists aren't willing to stifle their creative vision in favor of a tried and tested studio approach. Because of this, despite being crafted by a wide range of different directors, a good number of Marvel films tend to feel pretty samey in structure and directorial style. Now, focusing on our top 3 critically rated Marvel films for a moment, particularly in the ways they're filmed, directed, and edited, there's nothing that truly stands out stylistically from the other. Of course, they do have their memorable moments and notably beautiful shots sprinkled in every now and again. The acrophobic atmosphere of the flight scenes in Iron Man, the ancestral plane in Black Panther, and the opening sequence and portal scene of Endgame come to mind, but nothing too bold or experimental in terms of its overall directorial style, camera work, or aesthetic. I mean, these are meant to be intense climactic scenes, but look how bland these shots look. And these movies were each directed by a different person, yet I honestly can't say I can describe a distinct personality for any of them. And yes, I know beyond these 3 there are the exceptions, I'll get to that later. But as far as their stories go, I think all 3 movies are pretty great in this department. Each one tells a pretty fast-paced, entertaining plotline with plenty of high-energy action scenes, even if the ways they're executed all kind of blend in with one another for me. But to give them credit, I think Martin kind of missed the mark when stating that Marvel movies are tied to a finite set of themes. Each of these 3 films deal with their own unique themes: Iron Man and militarism, Black Panther and minority oppression, time, redemption, and sacrificial love in Endgame. Even looking beyond these movies, Marvel's films tend to deal with a wide variety of stories and themes. You can't possibly tell me that Guardians of the Galaxy 2 had the same themes as Civil War, or Homecoming having the same themes as WandaVision. Just from these 4, we've already got distinct themes of family, political themes of power and utilitarianism, coming-of-age themes of identity and acceptance, and love, grief, and trauma. Funny how Scorsese made this little criticism considering he's got similar themes across a significant portion of his movies. Not all, but a good number of them. These being power, religious guilt, and corruption. It's not a bad thing, and these subject matters form his cinematic trademark at this point. But with that in mind, saying that Marvel relies on a limited set of story themes is kind of an odd criticism to make, and is also inaccurate. However, critics of Marvel have pointed out that their stories can get pretty formulaic, and I do think that there is some truth to this. For one thing, because they're all part of a cinematic universe involving eventual sequels and crossover events, you often know that for the most part, these heroes aren't gonna die, so the stakes don't really feel all that high for our leading characters. Not unless they've been given at least 3 or 4 movies to star in. Black Panther wasn't gonna fool me with that waterfall death shit. Why did they spend so much time pretending he was actually done for? The same goes for Endgame. I mean, of course half those heroes that got Thanos were gonna come back. This doesn't mean that it didn't manage to pack an emotional punch regardless, but I'll get to that. And another ingredient to the Marvel formula that can honestly get pretty tiring is the shoehorning of lame, quippy-ass dialogue.
And you are? Wow. Just one? Like Adele or Aristotle? Drake? I don't know. Eminem?
Yeah, can we move on? No, don't get me wrong, a little bit of lighthearted dialogue is good. It saves your characters from being thoroughly brooding edgelords that just take themselves way too seriously. Snyder. The concept of superheroes itself is already kinda silly. They're essentially crime-fighting cosplayers. Look at this shit. So to inject a bit of comedy for self-awareness or to double down on the often absurd concepts of these movies will work to their benefit. Among our top 3 Marvel flicks, Iron Man and Endgame strike a pretty fine balance with this, and to give their other movies credit, the approach fits particularly well with Guardians of the Galaxy and Thor Ragnarok, cause these two were especially crafted to amp up the silliness of their stories. But I guess the execs got a little too excited with the success of this kind of script in the first Avengers, you know, with that signature Whedon snark, because it since became a tired staple in a lot of these films and often ruined characters altogether.
We'd have to break anything.
Clearly you've never made an omelet. I can't physically throw up in my mouth. People create smaller people. Children. I lost the word there.
Between Endgame, Iron Man, and Black Panther, the last sadly falls victim to this most.
I'll make it right.
The real question is, what are those?
Painting every character's dialogue with this smart alecky coat of paint places them in danger of all sounding the same. Those clever one-liners aren't so clever or novel anymore if everyone's given them, and it can likely blend their personalities with one another. I'm not saying Scorsese's films are paragons of dialogue, but at least they don't heavily rely on the same shtick. And on the topic of characters, one could argue that the portrayal and development of these movies' leads, judging each film on its own, that is, don't cut as deep as they probably could, certainly not like in Scorsese's works. For one thing, there's greater focus on action and spectacle. These are, after all, ultimately superhero action flicks and not intense character studies. But this can leave its stories reliant on flashy, fast-paced scenes to deliver the emotional highs of the plot. For example, Iron Man sacrificing himself to defeat Robot Lebowski, T'Challa and Killmonger going toe-to-toe, every MCU hero in an all-out battle by the end of Endgame. Video essayist Thomas Flight actually did a really good video dissecting this, so I do recommend checking out his video for more of his insight. It's not that we don't get personal, quiet moments of character development, but by having to share the spotlight with these many thrilling action sequences, we aren't given as many scenes as, say, a Scorsese film to truly spend time with the character and their intimate dramas. Emotional investment is all the more challenging with ensemble movies like Civil War, Infinity War, and Endgame, where your attention is split amongst a wide range of characters, not really giving you enough time to fully absorb and feel for their personal, individual struggles and desires. Okay, so laying all that down, a lot of these criticisms are due to the fact that these films all fall under one unifying franchise. Being under the same studio and sharing the same cinematic universe, they can't stray too far from the established look, feel, and storytelling structure of these films, aka what the audience is already familiar with. It's why their methodical, formulaic approach works. Audiences like knowing what they're in for when they go in to watch these films. You do go into a Marvel film expecting bombastic action scenes. You do go into a Marvel film expecting to see your favorite comic superheroes on screen, sometimes all at once. You aren't exactly going into these expecting challenging art films, you're going into them to have a fun time. With this in mind, sure, I can see how Scorsese would be concerned that with Marvel being the most commercially popular film franchise at the moment, it could leave general movie audiences with an oversaturation of safe or samey films, surefire, profitable bets for movie producers. films. And I can also see why moviegoers would get burnt out from seeing the annual wave of Marvel releases, causing them to start seeing these movies as nothing more than corporate products or formulaic pictures. Like I said, to some extent, they're right. These criticisms do apply to many aspects of Marvel's most critically acclaimed films, as I broke down earlier. But these movies, and many other Marvel films beyond them, also have their innovative strengths, and have taken artistic risks in plenty other ways we have to give them credit for. Aspects that Scorsese has overlooked, that are perhaps simply foreign to the world of movies he's grown up and is familiar with. For one thing, Marvel movies are constant game changers when it comes to the realm of special effects. With Iron Man, for instance, the film presented its VFX team with the challenge of conserving the practical look of Stark's armor for the Mark I, adhering to director Favreau's vision of realism, while still granting Downey and his character ease of movement. They ended up having him wear only part of the armor while the rest was completed in CG and motion capture. The next two suits were completely CGI, while using actual practical suit designs by Stan Winston's school as their basis. Their efforts even ended up getting nominated at the 2009 Academy Awards. Other Marvel films like 2011's Captain America: The First Avenger had the creation of Skinny Steve, implementing the use of innovative 2D image manipulation. There was also the introduction of new VFX tricks for 2016's Doctor Strange, one of which being the use of mathematical mass duplication to effectively craft its trippy worlds and sequences. All of this has paved the way for the visual spectacles in Endgame, which, speaking of, we've got to give the MCU credit for popularizing and successfully pulling off the concept of cinematic universes. The amount of effort and creativity it takes to plan, write, and chart out all these different character arcs, worlds, and events all under one overarching story is a massive accomplishment. And it's not an easy thing to do, just look at the dark universe. Sad. And yes, some harsh critics do have a point in that a lot of these Marvel movies fall victim to uniform style and tone, but it's worth noting how Marvel seems to be hiring more directors of various genres lately, including indie darlings Taika Waititi and James Gunn for their comedic backgrounds, and Sam Raimi for his experience in directing horror. The studio does seem to be slowly creeping out of its comfort zone and is increasingly trying new things, whether it's dabbling in the more absurd time-space concepts of Doctor Strange and Guardians, the meta humor of Deadpool, the more horror movie angle it seems to be going for with Multiverse of Madness. The more they keep doing this, the more they'll allow for new directorial styles to flourish. I also think it's worth bringing up how the franchise has functioned as a helpful launchpad for once indie filmmakers. Ryan Coogler's big break with Black Panther, for example, and Jon Favreau for the first two Iron Man films. Finally, the storytelling may not be as character intense as a Scorsese flick or other art house drama films, much less so if you're diving into a crossover movie like Endgame or Civil War for the first time, where they struggle to fully flesh out each protagonist's character arc. But that doesn't mean these movies don't have emotional impact. With the help of a wider universe structure, the MCU offers us a new, different kind of film experience in that audience investment and character development is built over time, over a multiple series of films, and it may not be everyone's cup of tea to do their homework when diving into movie franchises like these, but I'd argue it gets you even more devoted to the characters and narratives involved. And here's what I mean about Endgame being one of the superhero film genre's greatest achievements, if not the greatest achievement to date. That ability to pay off years of emotional investment. To some people, this may merely be shallow fan service, that it's weak as its own unique standalone movie. But I don't think it was ever trying to be that to begin with. I think, taking a page from television, cinema has simply evolved to also foster this long-term audience investment, rewarding them in a sense for being loyal viewers of certain films and franchises. You can't deny the emotional catharsis this brings to most audiences, and sure, while a lot of their sentimental scenes do hinge on moments of spectacle, that doesn't mean that the emotional weight isn't there. Plenty of these spectacle moments don't feel empty, because at the core of them, you've got an often effective, moving performance from our leading actors on top of your longtime investment in their goals and story arcs. Without this, they'd just be another Michael Bay action sequence. And then you've got the longtime comic fans who typically have a much deeper attachment. Kevin Smith in particular describes these movies as almost like time machines. He says, I can still step into one of those comic book movies, divorce myself of the fact that I do this for a living, release, and my dead dad is back for a minute. For 2 hours. And it's personal for a lot of the audience, and we're arguing whether or not this counts as cinema. Because isn't that what it's all about at the end of the day? To make films that leave a lasting, profound impact on viewers? And hey, maybe a Scorsese or Coppola or Kubrick film does that better for you than a Marvel or superhero flick, but that doesn't mean the latter isn't capable of it too for a lot of people, especially with a fan base loyal to decades of previous comic book material. So with all that said, Scorsese definitely has a point about Marvel and films like it, and as much as I agree with most of what he said, I do think his statements have stripped these movies of credit in areas where they specifically have made cinematic achievements. He's careful not to label them as cinema or narrative films, and yes, they are a lot like theme park rides in that they're mostly fun, action-packed popcorn pushers, but as we've seen, they've also managed to accomplish both artistic and emotional feats at the same time. It's most certainly not everyone's thing, and I do agree we're getting smothered by a bit too much of them these days. But as far as the MCU versus cinema debate goes, I'd argue they still very much check the boxes of what cinema is regardless. However, on that last issue, Scorsese and similar critics do have another point worth discussing.
And it's great to go to an event like an amusement park, but don't crowd out Greta Gerwig, and don't crowd out Paul Thomas Anderson and Noah Baumbach and those people. Just don't, in terms of theaters.
While much of the social media buzz surrounding Scorsese's piece focused on his supposed disdain of Marvel and franchise pictures, it was actually his concluding opinions in the article that stood out to me most. He states, "In many places around this country and around the world, franchise films are now your primary choice if you want to see something on the big screen. It's a perilous time in film exhibition, and there are fewer independent theaters than ever. The equation has flipped and streaming has become the primary delivery system. Still, I don't know a single filmmaker who doesn't want to design films for the big screen, to be projected before audiences in theaters." With the massive hype, exposure, and marketing given to Marvel and franchise films, it does seem like these type of movies are edging out more independent works in commercial theaters. Walk into your local cinema and franchise blockbusters do take up more screens and for longer. In contrast, the more indie or art house stuff are given limited releases and screen time, sometimes absent from the lineup altogether. Rather, it's more common to see these films relegated to independent theaters, a sector that's been struggling for a while, particularly after a certain devastating worldwide crisis. This can potentially leave us with less diversity in the commercial film industry, limiting the vast types of valuable art accessible to us. But the whole issue is a lot more complex than simply franchise films are killing indie cinema. For one thing, many argue that it's the blockbusters that get people interested to go to the cinema in the first place. This is especially critical at a time where the economy is recovering. It's the new Marvel, Fast and Furious, and Disney releases that are going to help keep theaters, and in turn, the smaller films they get to spotlight, afloat. The fact that a lot of big-name actors from well-known franchises are still willing to do smaller projects, think Robert Pattinson, Adam Sandler, Adam Driver, and ScarJo, also grants greater exposure to these lesser-known pictures, forming a sort of symbiotic relationship. They can even help fund the more independent ventures of their crew. Marvel's Karen Gillian, for example, has now built up enough recognition to get her indie film titled The Party's Just Beginning off the ground. Secondly, we're getting more independently released films than ever. Research shows that indie releases have actually skyrocketed from 1995 to 2016, while the number of big blockbuster hits have stayed about the same. This is according to findings by film industry data researcher Stephen Follows. Additionally, he found that over the last 2 decades, 5.7% of the feature films made in the US were released by one of the 5 major Hollywood studios: Disney, Paramount, Sony, Universal, and Warner Brothers, leaving a whopping 94.3% to be independent releases. Yet it's the fight for audience attention that seems to be the main struggle. In that same study, it was found that 9 out of 10 of these films didn't get a theatrical release, that is, shown in commercial cinemas. And most of those that did reach cinemas didn't earn enough to recover the costs of production, marketing, and distribution. It doesn't help that plenty of independent theater chains, where audiences are more likely to watch such pictures, have been on life support, or have closed up shop altogether due to a worldwide incident. And smaller cinemas in the US have actually taken a tumble since 2014, whereas larger cinemas have increased, suggesting moviegoers are going to larger theaters that more likely cater to bigger blockbuster releases. Then there's the potential hold large movie studios have on commercial theaters. During The Last Jedi's release, Disney required cinemas to show the movie in their largest auditorium for at least 4 whole weeks, suggesting the unreasonable demands these corporations can place and get away with on cinemas. All these factors do paint the picture of a more hostile theatrical climate, and even Joe Russo, director of a good handful of Marvel films, admitted himself that it is a tough market, even for us coming off of Avengers Endgame, to make a darker, character-driven movie. Imagine just how much harder it'd be for an up-and-coming filmmaker without the large industry connections or an iconic studio brand attached to their name. On the upside, the rise of streaming platforms seems to be a pretty effective alternative to make money and gain exposure. They're not only a convenient way for one to catch up on movies and TV shows from the comfort of their own home, but to gain access to a wide breadth of them. This, it seems, is where the indies can truly thrive in the modern age. We've got streaming services that particularly cater to niche up-and-coming films, platforms like Mubi, IndieFlix, Canopy, Shudder, just to name a few. And the good news is, these platforms and theaters don't actually cannibalize each other, as Vox puts it. This means those consuming movies at home through a streaming service actually also still go to the movies quite a lot. But of course, marketing plays a huge key role in keeping the indies afloat, particularly if you're aiming for a theatrical release. As Scorsese notes, most filmmakers still craft their movies to be seen on the big screen, as a communal event with top quality audiovisuals and little opportunity to tamper with or distract yourself from the viewing experience. Independent studios and filmmakers will have to adapt to new promotional methods, making noise on social media being a prime example. Tapping into the influencer sphere and building word of mouth through Instagram, YouTube, or Twitter are all effective forms of exposure in the digital age. But the ultimate goal is to create a sense of theatrical urgency, or something to instill enough FOMO in viewers to get them out of the house and into a theater. Now, Marvel films have it easy. They've got decades of comic book history and an ever-growing audience built during the span of time to rely on. They could put out the shittiest trailer and people are still gonna watch their movies. Just look at Ant-Man and the Wasp if you still remember that existed. Indie films, on the other hand, are gonna have to be a little more clever. For instance, Robert Eggers' 2015 The Witch not only made use of Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to spread word about the film, but created a Twitter account for one of their characters, which was engaging enough to garner nearly 11,000 followers. They even partnered with the Satanic Temple to create a website called the Satanic Revolution, which, as intended, garnered the attention of journalists and nearly had the director banned in Poland. Regardless, by leveraging the digital space, they got the word out in a really innovative way, and to massive success. The Witch was not only critically acclaimed, but was also a box office hit, grossing $40 million in the box office with a mere $4 million budget. And this was without the clout of a big studio label, or a comic book line, or established franchise material. Riskier, independent successes like these fall in line with Scorsese's comments of today's movie trends. If people are given only one kind of thing and endlessly sold only one kind of thing, of course they're going to want more of that one kind of thing. In other words, it's not that audiences aren't open to movies beyond the Marvel or blockbuster realm, it's that we need to find ways of building independent pictures the exposure, accessibility, and audience interest they deserve. Indie film company A24 is currently on fire with this, by the way, launching so many quality small films to industry success. So it's very much possible and gives me hope for the future with this side of cinema. Because I believe there's definitely room for both the popcorn flicks and the art house pictures in the world of movies, and I don't think it'd be the same without either. So, as always, I'd love to hear what your guys' thoughts are on this whole thing. What do you guys think about the state of the film industry today, and the impact that franchise films and dominating trends like superhero movies have on the field? Feel free to start a discussion and share your arguments down below, just, keep it civil. Thanks again to Game Beauty for sponsoring this video. Like I said, all links to their stuff and my discount code are down in the description below. Like and subscribe and all that jazz if you like these pop culture essays and want to see more of them. Maybe even hit that notification bell to keep up to date on my latest stuff. And I'll catch you guys in the next one.